Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. It's actually my first time in Copenhagen. I think I might have stayed here on the way somewhere else, middle landing in between, but I've never actually stayed in Denmark or in Copenhagen, so this is my first time, and I'm very pleased to be here, very pleased to see so many people here as well. So who am I? I'm 26 years old, like Katrin said, and since the last September, since the last election in Sweden, I'm also a member of the Swedish Parliament. I've been active in the Sweden Democrats since 2009. And the first years I studied at the same time, bioinformatics and some mathematics. And then I got an offer I couldn't refuse in 2011 when we got first elected into the Parliament. So since April 2011, I've been working in the Parliament as a secretary to Mattias Karlsson, who is now the leader while Jimmy Åkesson is away. I'm responsible for 4 different themes in our politics, and it's all the more difficult subjects in Sweden to talk about. It's integration, it's equality between genders, it's family, and it's minorities and how we treat them and how to make sure that we have a country that's all together. And I'm here today to talk a bit about the Sweden Democrats, what we stand for in our politics, but more so how we try to get our politics known in Sweden, our struggles to get known for what we stand for and not what other people tell us that we stand for, because I've very often heard what I'm supposed to think and what other people say that I actually think, because I'm lying all the time when I speak. I have a hidden agenda, a secret that no one else is supposed to know, and somehow we all know the secret agenda in the party, and we have the same shared secret agenda. So I'm here also to talk about free speech and what's really going on in Sweden today and what's been going on for the past decades. The Sweden Democrats was founded in 1988, so like me, 26-year-old, soon to be 27. Actually, we have our anniversary the 9th of February, so it's soon birthday time for the party. It was founded from different organizations that were more of activist organizations, all from more liberal Framstegspartiet, the sibling party to what became Fremskrittspartiet in Norway now, to more radical anti-immigrations activists of different kind. They wanted somehow to formalize, to become a serious party who took these questions seriously and actually tried to create politics about it. It's been a struggle. The first few years were, I don't know much about them as I was a baby, but I read and I've heard. And if you read the first programs of the party, actually it doesn't differ so much from where we are now. If you take into the context that it was 2 decades and a half ago, and the language has changed in Sweden, the situation has changed and everything has changed. We speak much more politically correct now than we did before. If you compare the magazines that we have in our party in the beginning of the 90s and with the other normal magazines, it's pretty much the same language. Then in 1991, we had another party in Sweden called Ny Demokrati, New Democracy, and they were quite populist, huge success in one election, and focused a lot of low taxes, anti-immigration, and a lot of different populist things at the same time, which made the leaders of our party at the same time to think that somehow they needed to be seen, somehow they needed to get through in this media anyway, even though Ny Demokrati existed. And they made some sidesteps that we're not so proud of today. They didn't really care about keeping clean as much as they should have, so to get PR and to be seen was much more important than to really make sure that everyone who was on a demonstration or who attended a meeting actually stood up for the values that the party stands for. And we still have to pay for it, because we still hear that we had Nazi sympathizers, Nazi people in our party. We still hear that we were wearing uniforms at our meetings and that kind of stuff, although that never was the party. But they just didn't keep as clean as they should have, and they let skinheads attend the demonstrations because the more, not the merrier, but the more PR, and that was important. In 1995, there was a change in leadership, and Mikael Jansson, who is now also a member of the parliament, took over, and he started once again the reformation to become really a serious party, working with politics like other parties do. At the same time, Jimmy Åkesson became a member and started to activate himself because he saw that the party was actually changing. He had read a bit about it before, and he saw that there was a wind that was changing, there was going to be a serious party. And it has continued since then. In 2005, Jimmy Åkesson and his friends became the new leaders of the party, and we've been basically doubling in each election ever since we started. Now as well, in 2010 we finally got into the parliament with 5.7% of the votes, and now last September in 2014, 4 years later, we got almost 13%, we got 12.9%. So more than a doubling. Our success have been handled in quite different ways from the other parties. In the first, when we got into Malmö for the first time in the local elections, I think it was in 2002, they changed the number of places in the different utskott, the different small committees, so that there wouldn't be room for us. And I know this because at that time I made a project in my school about how to use anti-democratic methods to secure the democracy. And I actually called our secretary at that time and asked him about this. I was not a member, and I was not very fond of the Sweden Democrats at that time, because all I heard and seen was that there's this Nazi party in Malmö's elected, and how do we handle them? But I made a project about how to use anti-democratic methods to secure democracy. How do we motivate that we have different limits to freedom of speech to make sure that dangerous ideas can't be heard? Because we have to secure. People are gullible, people are stupid. We need to secure them, we need to save them from these terrible ideas. That's the hypothesis, and that's somehow what still so many people are thinking, and basically how Sweden is run today. When it finally got near the elections in 2010, and the other parties started to realize that we might actually get in, there was talking again about maybe reducing the amounts of seats in the different committees in the parliament, once again to make sure that we didn't get any places. The Social Democrats and the Moderate Party, they went out to the media and said that they won't give any of their places to us, because the smaller parties have since long time ago, they've been giving places in the different committees to make sure that everyone is represented, that all the opinions are heard while you discuss the subjects, but they wouldn't give any places to us. Fortunately, they didn't. They kept the places to 17, and we got our place. I'm going to show you a few pictures as well, because it's not just, and it's not mainly from the other parties, and somehow it's understandable that other parties try to talk bad about it, negative campaigning, they want to keep their power. It's good for them. Somehow I can understand it, even though, of course, I would prefer to be actually attacking what we stand for and not make up what we stand for. But we've been also worked against quite a lot by the media. And I'm going to show you a few examples, if I just can find them there. of magazines. The day of the election in 2010, this was the front page of Expressen, which is one of the biggest nationwide nighttime newspapers in Sweden. And that's a vote for us. It's been stampled upon, it's down on the ground, it's just thrown out. And they say that no, today we will vote for Sweden and against främlingsfientlighet, against bad thinking about people from foreigners, about foreigners. So one of the biggest newspapers in Sweden on the election day had a massive campaign against us, basically telling the people in Sweden how to vote, or rather how to not vote. It's quite interesting. A few years ago I met a person from Italy, who's an active politician from Italy, and I told him that in Sweden we are allowed to campaign on the election day. And he was stunned that we are allowed to campaign, because on the election day you're supposed to think about it, calm down, and then you go and vote. You cast your vote without having any last-second influences. In Italy it's apparently forbidden to have campaigns on election day. And this is it's not only campaigning, it's campaigning against a specific choice. When it was the elections for the European Parliament last year, or the year before last, no, it was last year, 2 years. There's been so many elections and so much talk about new elections, so I'm a bit confused with all the elections going on. They didn't do the campaign on the front page on the election day. However, the day after, this was the front page of the same magazine, same newspaper, Expressen. It says Fy fan, where Fy is the name of the feminist party. In Sweden, where they have this happy, joyful picture of they got elected into the parliament. And then fan, they swear and they tell Europe to be ashamed of themselves with a picture of our success in the European elections. Because apparently Europe and Sweden should be ashamed that nationalist or anti or EU critical parties got elected and got this huge success that we did in the last election. And of course, when we had our regular elections to the parliament, of course they would have a new front page again. It was a success for us once again. Like I said, almost 13%. So the day after, they were just sad. There was a completely black sorrow page that told us how many people voted for the Sweden Democrats. Because we should never forget how many people voted for us. Their competitor, the other big evening newspaper in Sweden, in 2010, they launched a campaign called Vi gillar olika, we like different, where everyone should put a hand on their profile picture or show that they stand up for different opinions, differentiality. However, of course, if that opinion is that you sympathize with the Sweden Democrats, you're not supposed to like that. And this year, they did pretty much the same thing. And also the same thing as Expressen, with Expressen focused on how many people voted for us. Aftonbladet told everyone to choose that they're one of the 87% that didn't. So it's basically huge campaigns to marginalize us, to make sure that everyone shows who they are and that they are decent people. They didn't vote for the Sweden Democrats. And these are just a few examples. I can also show you one still going on. I don't really remember when this was. It was last year. I don't remember if it was before the European election or if it was before or near the the election to the Swedish Parliament. But in a local newspaper, one of the bigger ones, but still a local newspaper, they have an article about how once again they tell us what Sweden Democrats are supposed to think, that everyone is supposedly has no value, and then they chose to illustrate this with a picture of our leader Jimmy Åkesson as a cockroach and an exterminator next to him. So it's quite rough.
Är det Sydsvenskan?
Nej, det är inte Sydsvenskan. Det är länstidningen. Jag kommer inte ihåg just nu exakt vilket län. It's not Sydsvenskan, but it's one of... Basically, it's been all over Sweden, all different local magazines, bigger magazines, newspapers, day papers, night papers. Basically, everyone has had their own kind of campaign against us. If someone writes anything that's even touching the subject of migration, of jihadists, of conflicts in the society due to different groups living segregated, you can bet on them also somehow mentioning that they're not Sweden Democrats and that they take they really don't want anything to do with us. And it's so common that there's actually a web page, a blog that really hates us, and their name is Inte Rasist Men. I'm not a racist, but, and that's an analogy to everyone always having to explain their views and to excuse their views beforehand. And of course, if there are racist views, it's of course not good and really weird. But I mean, when people actually say, people are so scared of telling quite just normal views or just facts that they have seen that there are conflicts in the society, but they still have to somehow declare they're not racist and they're not Sweden Democrats. They don't think this, but they have to explain. It's full of, in Sweden we call it brasklapp. It's from an old story where a man left a note saying, it's kind of like Pontius Pilatus, he washed his hands, he didn't want anything to do with it. He said there are some other reasons that forced him to say this. But I really don't want anything to do with it. So there was a question about how it is to be a Sweden Democrat, and this is what we can see from the media, what we can see in the debates. If you say anything that in any way can be regarded as a little bit similar to what we say, you always have to explain or excuse yourself. I remember, I think it was about a year ago, there was also from this second newspaper, evening newspaper, Aftonbladet, one of their columnists, I think is also editor of the cultured pages. He got very mad at people for tweeting to Sweden Democrats as if we're normal people. And to just, as he said, mystwittra, this cozy, normal chatting with us. It's not supposed to be like that. You're not supposed to treat us like normal human beings, because if you do that, then you normalize our opinions, you normalize us, and we cannot have that. We're supposed to be paria. After the elections in 2010, one of our members, actually with a background as a migrant, he wasn't born in Sweden, he got stabbed, he got attacked with knives. And in a debate after the election, I think it was Mattias Karlsson who was in that debate. Otherwise, it was the leaders of the parties. He asked Fredrik Reinfeldt, who was our statsminister at the time, and he asked everyone there, how can it be, what do you have to say when our our people get stabbed just for being Sweden Democrats. And the answer, it might have been that the answer was in a news magazine, and he just took it up in the debate. But anyway, Fredrik Reinfeldt, he said something like, people who live on showing differences between groups, they shouldn't be surprised if these kind of things happen. Pretty strong. I've had, I've been pretty lucky. My family is wonderful, and even though my sisters really don't agree with me politically, they still know who I am, and they just think that I'm crazy or somehow that I will come to my senses. But they still have this, they want to understand why I've chosen my party, and they still want to talk, and they still know that I'm me. And my mother, of course, she's worried a bit because of the situation, and also because she's not really sure of what my party stands for. But she knows me, and she's there's never been anything like not knowing me any longer. But I've had members of the party, friends, who've been shunned from their families. The worst thing that ever happened to me was that a couple of friends said that they won't meet me anymore or talk to me anymore. Actually, last Christmas, an old friend from school, we were having some kind of reunion, and when she found out, and they had planned it beforehand, and I just came in a bit late, and when she found out that I was also invited, she said that, well, if she comes, I cannot come. So I stayed at home, and I met my friends another day instead. But that's the worst that's ever happened to me. Like I said, I had friends that have been shunned from their families. There are quite a few people who have lost their jobs. They've been kicked out of the unions. Quite a few unions actually have it now, formal decisions that if you are an active member of the Sweden Democrats, if you stood on our list to become elected, or if you are in a somehow active and seen, you actively stand for being a Sweden Democrat, then you cannot be a member of their union anymore. Quite common. After the elections in 2010 again, the extreme left came to rising again quite hard against us. And I know that about a year or so, they specifically tried to hunt down the women that are active, representing our party. Easy targets, they thought, even though we're not so easy targets, we're quite strong. But there were quite a few that got stones thrown into their homes, through windows, cars wrecked, hateful mails and letters, threats, often also threats against them as mothers, telling them that they should think about their kids, not being active in Sweden Democrats, because think about the danger that your kids are in whilst you're active. Very, very hard blows. But we're quite tough and rough in a way. So we're still here, and we're apparently growing. So how do they handle that politically? Once again, after the election 2010, one would think that it would be quite a strong signal, because everything basically that was known about us by then, at least nationwide, more was known in the south of Sweden, where we've been in the local communities, when we've been seen, had different politics. But nationwide, basically, truthfully, what was known about us was that we had opinions about how the immigration to Sweden is handled. It's not handled in a way that we can welcome people to our country. It's not handled in a way where people who come have the same opportunities as people who are born or have lived here for a long time. Quite often they have better opportunities, special fundings. We've seen how segregation grows and all these problems that follows when you don't handle migration in a good way. So what people knew about us was that we were against this. We wanted to change these things. We wanted to have regulations on migration. And even though we were known as this one-question party, we got into the parliament. One would think that that would be a pretty strong signal that you really have to think about these questions. You have to make some kind of stand. You have to realize that somehow quite a few people around the country think that these questions are so important that they choose a new party without experience of being in the national parliament at least. They choose this party because they need change. They see problems growing. Instead, the Alliance, they teamed up with Miljöpartiet, who is quite radical in the other way, quite opposite, open borders and in as many ways as possible. And they had this migration agreements which liberated a lot of rules that we had. It liberated the work migration even more, and it also, after a few years, made sure that not only people who are not Swedish citizens and are in the country legally, but people who are in our country illegally, without even they're hiding from the government. They have been denied to stay in our country because they didn't have the reasons that we have rules for. People who actively hide from our government and who are in our country illegally, they should get medical care, and not only the one that you desperately need, acute, because that has been legal in Sweden, and of course, if someone is dying, you should give them health care. But even health care that's not really needed right now should be given. It should also be given cheaper than the Swedish citizens. Dental care, cheaper than the Swedish citizens. People who don't follow our laws are being rewarded by getting into our welfare structure in better ways than if you're born in Sweden, if you're legally immigrant to Sweden. So they went quite the opposite direction. Of course, that meant that in this election, this autumn, we more than doubled. Another reason, it's been for quite a few years, we've heard that migration to Sweden, immigration, it's always good for the economy. It's never a cost. They based this on how it's been before, you know, when we actually had work in Sweden, when people came from countries quite near us and quite easily could get introduced to our systems and become part of the society, where we had room, we had buildings, we had homes that we could offer. That's not the situation today. And even then, it's always been a little bit of a cost, at least in the beginning. And all the statistics that we have say that it takes quite a few years before migrants even get their first job in Sweden. And that's not a full-time job. I think the median time is 7 years to get some kind of income by themselves. That's quite a long time. And to get it up to the level that the Swedish-born population have, it takes even more time, and it never pays back what we invest. So economically, it's definitely not, again, not the way we handle migration right now. And especially not these big waves of refugees, because we cannot handle that. We're not prepared. We do not have the buildings, the homes. We do not have the healthcare, we do not have schools, we do not have workplaces, we do not have people who can teach Swedish, who can welcome into the society. And then a few weeks, about a month before the election, the Prime Minister, he actually had to say this because it's been counted upon. The new numbers from Migrationsverket, the government that's responsible for migration, they showed how the new prognosis about how many people were coming to Sweden talked suddenly about 85,000, maybe 90,000 this year, the 2015. It's been actually rising again now. I'm talking about 100,000 or even more. And that's just refugees. To that we of course have family members that will come later, and then all the other migration to Sweden as well. So these new numbers rose, and suddenly some journalists started to count on this and came to the conclusion that during 4 years we would need 48 more billions of Swedish kroner in the budget for the government. And still, that's for a prognosis that we knew would be rising even more, and that's only for the most basic welcoming to Sweden, for the handling of the question of whether they could come to Sweden or not, for the living during the first time in Sweden. Nothing about what we will have to pay for building new schools, building new homes, the extra resources that will be needed in the healthcare, all these things, that's not counted in. And like I said, not the families as well. So suddenly they couldn't keep it up anymore and say that this is not a cost for the society. So Fredrik Reinfeldt, he held his big speech. All the party leaders have some summer speeches. And of course, election year, there are even more media about it. And he had his speech and he addressed this, the fact that it actually costs a lot. But he didn't address it in a way that would suggest what we should do to handle it. All he basically said, or at least everything that was remembered from that speech, is that you have to open your hearts. Translated to, you have to open your wallets. Needless to say, the moderate party was the one that lost most voters to us in the last election. Because the problem is, it's easy if you have a lot of money to say that we can afford it in Sweden. I have grown up in a good place in Sweden. My friends were some of the richest in our country. And I remember when I talked to my friend about these questions and about migration a couple of years ago, and she said that, well, of course, we can afford it. It's a rich country. And I'm like, yeah, but you know, not for everyone. We have our elderly people who cannot afford medicines for themselves. We have schools that don't really function anymore. We have, and it's not only about the money, it's also about the society breaking up. We have places, areas in Sweden where neither the people who live there or the one who visit say that it's Sweden really anymore. It doesn't feel like Sweden. There's this famous picture of a place, of a news on TV. There was an inslag, a sending from in the news from a place in Malmö, I think, where there's a woman. I don't know if she's from where she's from originally, but she's very happy because she says this feels like home. it's a divided country. We have kids growing up in Sweden who don't define themselves as Swedes, who feel more connected to the country where their parents once came from than to Sweden, than to their neighbors and their school friends. And of course, this tears on a community. We have gangs growing, gangs that are based on ethnicity. This is something that I really don't want to see in my country. And when other people accuse us for being the racist party, accuse us for being the party that talks about and creates we and them, I'm thinking, what are you talking about? It's your politics that have divided our country. It's your politics that make differences between people who are born in Sweden or who are here legally and those who just came here, or even those who are here illegally. It's your policies that have divided our society, where the question of class now also is the question of ethnicity, where workplaces are divided and whole branches, whole areas of work are divided into whether you're born in Sweden or in Europe, or whereas you came from another country far away. Whether you work in a restaurant cooking the food or cleaning up depends on your ethnicity, basically, because that's how divided our countries. It's not really possible to become part of the majority society anymore. Most people, it is possible, but so many people are just stuck in these areas, segregated areas. And of course, people see this. That's why we grow. And to say that we have to open our hearts, that's not the solution. Because it's not closed hearts. That's the problem. Sweden is ranked in the top when it comes to tolerance. In the tops when it comes to welcoming new people. We're very polite, almost too polite, quite often. Naive, some people will call it. And very curious. Always been. That's not the problem. The problem is that when we cannot handle migration, when it comes too many, too short, to small societies, or to societies that are already divided, those divisions, they grow. There have been numbers where a small town, almost, I think, it was 5,000 citizens in that town or something, in about a week, just quite suddenly, 700 immigrants. 700 immigrants to a town with a population of 5,000. 200 new children to school. People notice this, and it's not about closed hearts. So after this last election, we grew. We're definitely the tip of the tongue. How do the other parties handle this? Do they talk to us? Do they say that, well, we really have to listen to what the voters say? We really have to realize why do they cast their votes on the Sweden Democrats? Well, to the last part, a little bit. I have to give them that. They have started to say that we have to listen to the voters. They continue by saying we have to tell them, we have to show them that there are alternatives. They still seem to think that the voters do not know what they vote for. They still seem to think that people who vote for us, they don't really want our policies. They don't really want our solutions or what we say. They just want to send a signal. But at least they're saying that not all the people who vote for us are racist anymore. That's a progress somehow. like Gudrun said, we're supposed to have an election right now. Not because we were supposed to have an election, because it was supposed to be an extra election. And the reason for this is that since the other parties, they might have to somehow confess that our voters exist and are decent people. After all, 13% of the population or of the voters, it's quite a lot of people you want to get back to vote for you. So it's no good calling them ugly words. But they still don't want to talk to us. They still want to isolate us. Which means that we suddenly have a division of 3 different blocks in Swedish politics. And no one has majority. No one is even close to majority. After the last election, the alliance, they almost had their own majority. I think we had 3 votes, 3 people too many for them to have their own majority. So we could swing the outcome of different votes. But now we're there in the middle and we're quite big. So that doesn't work anymore. And the alliance, the 4 parties on that side, the right parties, they still want to keep together as this bloc and not negotiate with the other side. And the Social Democrats have formed their government together with Miljöpartiet, the radical open borders party, like I mentioned before. They're quite radical in quite many ways, very cute in a way, because I find them quite naive. And there's also the Left Party, who they're not in the government, but they're still supporting them indirectly. So we have 3 blocks, and since the alliance won't split up and won't negotiate with the Social Democrats had to negotiate with the Left Party and with Miljöpartiet, of course, because they formed the government together. And as a result, the budget that was put forward for Sweden was very much influenced by both Miljöpartiet and Vänsterpartiet, Left Party. And it contained lots of suggestions that we know there is not a majority for in the parliament. Since election day, there have been suggestion after suggestion, different policies laid forward as if they would become reality that are not supported by a majority in the parliament. So we made a decision in our party, both based on this fact that all the others want to isolate us, also based on the fact that both budgets, both the one from the government and also the one from the alliance, basically the same thing, not so many differences. There were, of course, differences, but what was good in one was bad in the other, but then the other one has something else that was good and that the first one lacked. So they weighed pretty much the same. Both were, of course, calculated completely wrong because neither took in account the family members that would come to the migrants, neither took in account all the extra expenses that I mentioned before. It was very basic on migration. And for the past 4 years when we've been in the parliament, we've seen that every year, every budget, we have a budget in the spring that can make some changes if they're needed, and then the big one in the autumn for the next year. And every budget, they have been forced to put more money to migration. Take money from giving to other countries and put it into migration. So of course, both of the budget alternatives were equally bad, in our opinion. And we made a stand that since no one is talking to us, no one is negotiating with us, and since all of them are having this naive view on economics and on society, all the governments that lay forward a budget alternative with politics that will increase, not only keep it at the same level, not making it less, but not increase the migration to Sweden. All alternatives that have politics that will increase, we will try to turn those governments down. Even if that would mean we have to do that by voting no to the budget, which we did. Not because the alternative from the alliance, which was much better, but at least this would mean that there would have to be some changes. We wouldn't idly stand by and just watch when a government did whatever they want to do and not thinking about the whole majority, not even caring about getting a majority supporting their politics. Kind of basic in a democracy otherwise. So what was the response to that? First, they said that there would be a new election. The same night, Stefan Löfven came out and said, this will be a new election. Because it was a new way in Sweden, and it was the first time that the government didn't get their budget through. So the people would, it would be fair to give them a chance to vote knowing this. Fair enough. It wasn't what we thought would happen. We thought that somehow someone would talk to each other, mainly the other ones, but at least they would somehow have to negotiate with each other to make a majority. But no. And then, whilst everyone was preparing for this extra election, there was also a group of members from the leaderships of the other parties, not the left party, but the other 6, negotiating with each other, not about politics, but how to make it possible for a government to make their budget win, even though they don't have a majority. Basically, they formed this December agreement. It was presented at 27th of December, where they said that they have promised each other that until 2022, for 8 years, the largest group, not the majority, but the largest minority would get their way through because the other group wouldn't vote. They would just stand idly by. They would let the other side win. Basically what this means is that they reduced the members of the Swedish Parliament from 349 to 279. The members of the 6 parties in this agreement. Whichever budget or whichever alternative amongst them gets a majority will win. And then they can just skip the formal votes in the parliament because they have already decided. All this, of course, to keep us out, because somehow they still count the left party amongst them. Otherwise, we would change government right now because the right side is bigger than the left side without left party. So basically, from 349 to 300, it's just our members of the parliament who our votes doesn't count anymore. It's, I dare say, quite an interesting view on democracy and on the way we have democracy in Sweden. In my opinion, if you would like to have a two-party system, which quite a few democracies over the world have, they have the majority election system, but then you should actually change the democracy into that kind of system, and you should have the proper pre-work and discussion, and the people should get to vote about this because it's quite a huge change in the constitution to make sure that there are only 2 alternatives. But they would like to have it in this way in an agreement. It is compliable. You can do it like that. You can have agreements. But I don't think that they will be rewarded by the voters in the next election. And I definitely think that if people should be allowed to vote because we suddenly changed the game rules by saying that we won't accept being ignored, then the Swedish people should definitely get to vote when we have this new agreement, when the parties tell their voters that we won't fight for our politics if we have a smaller minority than another minority. They have said that they want it all or nothing. Rather than negotiate with each other, form alternatives that can actually have some kind of foundation with some kind of majority. They say all or nothing. And I think also it's quite fun because one of the strongest arguments that have been used for this agreement is that it should be, finally it's possible to rule the country again in minority, because we had most governments have been formed by a minority. It's been the Social Democrats, and they had about 40% maybe, but they've been supported by the Left Party, but it's not been in the government. And now finally it's possible again to rule the country. Finally it's easy again to rule the country. And I stand there once again thinking, what are you talking about? Running a country shouldn't be easy. Running a country is a huge responsibility. And standing up for our democracy, making sure that the decisions you make represent a majority of the population, take into account a majority of the population. Best of all would be if they took into account all the voters, but at least a majority. It's not easy, but it's very much important. But now we have this agreement instead. I've been talking quite long now. Yeah. There's so much to say, but maybe it's time for the break.
Well.